Well, they announced it was going to be Pastor Dave, so I thought maybe I was off the hook today. But I'm not seeing him. So I guess we actually have two options. We could, like in college, if the professor is, 5 minutes late, then class is dismissed. Or I guess you can just deal with listening to me today. We are actually, I'm not Pastor Dave, but we are on part 2, week 2 of our journey to the cross. Hopefully all of you got your book and are following along with us in the devotions. It's just a great opportunity for us to lean into God together as a church family as we go through the season of Lent. I was catching up with a friend from high school about a month ago, and we were talking about different things and discussing different people from school and what they were up to, where they had gone. And as we were talking, he said, he goes, I didn't keep up with quite as many people. He goes, I don't know if you're aware of this, John, but I wasn't as social in high school as you were. And I thought about that, and I guess I never really considered myself to be a social guy. So I asked my wife, who is very much an introvert, and she goes, you are absolutely an extrovert. And I was shocked. I thought about that for a little bit, and I was like, well, how did this come about? Like, is this just my natural personality? What is it? And I came to the conclusion, and I didn't even have to go to therapy for this. I said, I can blame my parents. You know why? Because they gave me all these brothers to grow up with. I had no choice but to be social. Now, I know what you're all expecting. This is the moment where John tells a really great story from childhood about his brothers. Maybe. I have to put a disclaimer out there because it was brought to my attention that some of my younger brothers have been watching my messages online, and they claim that I have a tendency to embellish the stories. Now, I recounted some of these stories with my older brothers, and they were like, no, that's absolutely how it happened. So before I tell anything, I have to say this to my brothers. If you're watching, you're younger than I am. You don't remember it the way it actually happened. I'm still mom's favorite, so nana nana boo boo. I had no choice but to be social. I had all of these brothers that I grew up with, most of them younger than me, and there was no such thing as having your own space in that house growing up. I think the fewest brothers I ever shared a bedroom with at any time was 2. So there were 3 of us in that room. My oldest brother, he actually got his own room. I think his senior year of high school, he actually got his own room. But we had to make a room in the basement in order to do so. We had one bathroom, too. There was nowhere to go. Because even if you tried to, I'm going to hole up in the bathroom for a few minutes and try and get some quiet. No, I need in there. 1 or 2, because if it's 1, you can go out back. Beauty of all being boys. But the only way we could really get any kind of space to ourselves or quiet time was to try and sneak off into the woods behind the house. But to get there, there was a very large pasture behind the house that you had to get through without being spotted. Because if you were, then it was, hey, where are you going? Can I come with you? Now, I would just ignore it and be like, oh yeah, I didn't hear that. And I'd just keep walking, maybe a little faster. And before long, you'd have people chasing after you. So even then, you didn't always get the quiet time that you were looking for. And I'm going to tell you now, as a teenager, when that happens, it kind of conjures up what we'll call emotions, I guess. And I would project said emotions onto my younger brothers in a very gracious manner. But I just wanted some time to myself. I wanted to get away from the noise and the chaos and the constant barrage of questions and will you play with me? Will you help me with this? How does this work? How does that work? Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? Some of your parents are going, I get the same thing from my teenager or my little kids. Yeah. Sometimes we just want to get away and have a little bit of quiet space, some time to ourselves. We're talking about Jesus' journey, his last trip to Jerusalem. And we say that because he knew what lay ahead of him when he got there. And so he has his disciples with him, and he's making this last journey. And I'm sure that he was thinking a lot about what was coming up. But as he made this trek, he was constantly surrounded by people. He had his disciples with him. There were crowds that followed him. I mean, look at this. This is just his guys hanging out with him, and they're making this long journey here, right? So last week, Dave was talking about when Jesus was teaching, and he said, if you want to follow me, you must deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Now, when he taught that, he was actually, I couldn't find a map that showed enough of it. He was up here in Caesarea Philippi, about 60 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. And so they left there and they traveled down, and as they came into Galilee, that was where he actually took Peter, James, and John and went up onto a mountain, and there was the transfiguration. He comes back down, he meets up with the rest of the disciples. They come down through Capernaum, and as they're traveling down through Galilee and into Samaria, and they get down in this area, and all of a sudden they meet opposition. This is where Jesus sent some of the disciples on ahead and said, hey, go and find a space for us. And they come back and they're like, nope, they don't want us there. And Jesus says, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. So they head east, they come down along the Jordan River, actually cross over it, follow the Jordan River down, and they come all the way down here into Jericho. So start to finish, it's about 120, 130-mile journey. They're walking because there were no Ubers back then. And the whole time he's doing this, he's got people following him. And he's teaching, and he's healing people. And I bet after a couple of weeks' journey, walking that far, constantly surrounded by people, I bet Jesus was at that point of just wanting some quiet space to himself. I mean, he was human after all. Yeah, the Son of God, he was perfect, but he was in human form. He was susceptible to the same feelings and emotions that we all go through. And I'd be willing to bet at that moment, as they're coming into Jericho, he was just like, man, I would love to find a place to hide and take a nap. But that didn't happen. And we're going to pick up here as they're coming into Jericho, starting in Mark chapter 10, verse 46. They reached Jericho, and as Jesus and his disciples left town, a large crowd followed him. Imagine that. Just could not get away, right? So, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus was sitting beside the road. When he heard that Jesus was nearby, he shouted, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. But many rebuked him and told him to be quiet. But he only shouted louder. Now, I'm going to wow you here with some amazing graphic design skills. Are you ready for this? Because I want you all to be able to picture this, okay? This is the street of Jericho. Pretty good, right? Imagine this is the main street coming through Jericho. And in those days, they often had on either side of the street, they would have booths and tents lined up with vendors that were there selling different things, and create this marketplace right in the main street, because then they could attract the most customers. And so obviously there was going to be this large crowd at marketplace, kind of scattered all over. These guys must have been selling something good because they're lining up like the self-checkout at Walmart over here. There's a large crowd here. Now I want everyone to just kind of use your imaginations a little bit. Pick someone here in this crowd and be that person for a moment. Busy marketplace, crowded. Obviously, there's going to be some noise and things going on. And all of a sudden, you start to feel, man, there's a lot more people here than usual. Well, maybe it's, we're coming up on the Passover. There's festivals. Maybe it's just more people out and about because of that. But as you start looking around, you notice there's this different crowd at market that day. And you're like, well, why are all these other people shoving into this already crowded space? What is happening here? So you start kind of like elbowing and shouldering your way through to try and see what's going on. And also you notice there's this other group, and you're like, ooh, who are those guys? Is that the disciples? So you start maybe on your tiptoes trying to get a better look, and you see Jesus. And you go, oh, that's that guy Jesus that I've heard so much about. He's here. He's in town. Maybe you try to get a little bit closer to him to see what's going on. You're kind of wondering, like, what's happening here? Is he gonna say something? Is he gonna talk about something? And then you realize, you hear this noise. And it's the final character of this story, and that's Bartimaeus, the blind beggar sitting in the street where he always has for the last however many years. Now, this is your normal marketplace. You're used to him being there, so you're probably going, like the rest of that crowd, hey, Bartimaeus, stop. Stop yelling. And he just keeps yelling and yelling out because he wants to get Jesus' attention, and he can't see. So he doesn't know if Jesus is right next to him, if he's on the other side, so he's yelling out. It's kind of like if you go to a sports event, you see your favorite player out there, you start yelling at them, cheering them on, and you think, man, if I just yell loud enough, they're going to hear me, and they're going to know I'm here. Or in the case of my son, who I've been coaching for many years in soccer, like, pretty sure when he's out playing on the field, the only voice he hears is mine, because I get extra loud. But he's yelling out. He's crying out to Jesus. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And as he's yelling, what happened? They rebuked him. They said, Bartimaeus, be quiet. Now, I was thinking about this. Why were they telling him to be quiet? Maybe it's like I mentioned, that they thought Jesus was going to stand up and teach and have something really important to say, and they wanted to hear it. That's the optimist in me that wants to believe that's why they were telling him to be quiet. But the realist in me says, well, they were probably the other way. Bartimaeus, you're a blind beggar sitting in the dirty street. Don't bother him. That's Jesus. He doesn't want to be annoyed by you. Stop yelling. Just be quiet and wait and see what's going to happen. But Bartimaeus didn't listen to them. He just shouted louder. And this is where the story gets really, really awesome. Because as he's continuing to shout, guess what happened? Jesus heard him, and he stopped. And he said, tell him to come here. See, Bartimaeus was calling out to Jesus, and in return, Jesus stopped and called out to him. And he said, tell him to come here. So now this same crowd that's telling Bartimaeus, just be quiet, now they've totally flipped this around because, oh, well, Jesus wants him. Something's going to happen. They called the blind man. Cheer up, they said. Come on. He is calling you. He is calling you. It's pretty powerful words right there. I would love to have been there and to witness this. I think maybe things would have been a little bit different if I was alive back then, because I think people kind of took Jesus for granted back then. They didn't know who he was. We have the beauty of living in a day and age where we know all about him. We know what he did for us in the crucifixion. But I think if those people could have had that kind of vision, it might have been a little bit different for them. See, Bartimaeus, even though he was blind, he had vision. He knew Jesus was the one that could heal him. So he's yelling out to him. And what an awesome thing when you're calling out to somebody, when they respond and call back to you. It's always a good feeling, isn't it? When you're asking someone for help, when they respond and say, yeah, come on, I'll help you. That's a really good feeling. And for someone like Bartimaeus, who basically had nothing, I bet that was beyond amazing. I bet that's a feeling and an emotion that we can't even begin to describe. There's probably some adrenaline there, maybe a little bit of nervousness, a lot of excitement, I'm sure. Maybe even a little bit scared because he wasn't sure what Jesus was going to do. But he believed what could happen. And so what does he do? He threw aside his cloak, he jumped up and ran to Jesus. He ran to Jesus. A blind man in a crowded space, and he ran to Jesus. He gets to him, and Jesus says, what do you want me to do for you? Now, to us, that's kind of like, okay, well, why would you ask that? It seems obvious. Jesus wanted him to speak it. He wanted him to say it. He wanted him to acknowledge what he was asking for. Speak it into existence. And so Bartimaeus says, my Rabboni, my teacher. You know what's great about this word Rabboni? It's only used twice in the entire Bible. Once is here, and the other is in John 20, when Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene after he resurrected. My teacher. It's personal. They have this connection with him. I want to see. And Jesus said, go. Your faith has healed you. Instantly, the man could see, and he followed Jesus down the road. What's so awesome about this is not the fact that Bartimaeus responded to the calling of Jesus, not the fact that Jesus restored his sight. What's really awesome about this is 2 or 3 weeks prior, 120, 130 miles away, Jesus was teaching, and he said, if you want to be my disciple, you must deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Do you think there's any possibility that blind Bartimaeus, that far away, would have known that that's what Jesus was teaching? It's not likely. I doubt anybody was live streaming that one. But Bartimaeus lived that out. He showed it. Because as I said, he threw aside his cloak. When you're, in those days, the cloak, a blanket essentially, a big blanket that they could wrap up in, it was their bed. It was what they sat on during the day. It was essentially their protection and shelter in the evenings and during the night. That was his one worldly possession. And oftentimes, as they sat there begging, the money that they collected, they would wrap it up in one corner of their cloak. So when Jesus called to Bartimaeus, he denied himself. He took his one worldly possession, any money that was in it, threw it away, and denied his one worldly possession. He denied himself. And then he took up his cross, because the next thing it says he did was he jumped up and ran to Jesus. His blindness was his cross to bear. That was his burden. And he didn't let that stop him from going to him. He did not let his cross prevent him from finding Jesus. He did not let his physical disability keep him from seeking God. He jumped up and ran. He took up his cross. And then as we see here, Jesus told him, you're healed. Go on. Most of us probably would have been like, awesome, I'm going to go see what things look like. Probably look down at yourself and go, oh man, I need a bath. Didn't realize my toenails were that long. But he didn't. Instantly, he could see, and he followed Jesus down the road. He followed Jesus. See, I believe that one of the reasons Jesus took the time to heal this man was to give that real world examples to his disciples that he had just taught the lesson to a few weeks prior. To show them what it looks like to truly deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow him. Bartimaeus lived that out in front of them. Real world examples. Bartimaeus believed, and that's why he was healed. Even when they were telling him to be quiet, he continued to call out. He knew that Jesus was the one that could fix what was broken. He knew Jesus had the power to restore and to heal. He knew that Jesus was the one that could change his life. See, I think we're all a bit like Bartimaeus. Maybe not blind in the physical sense, but we allow things to get between us and God. We allow ourselves to be blinded by our sins and let that separate us from God. And sometimes when it does get bad enough, like Bartimaeus, we do start calling out to him. But Bartimaeus knew that God could heal. We can know that too. And like Bartimaeus, we need to persevere. And even if we feel like I'm too far in, I can't, God doesn't want me, be like Bartimaeus. He didn't think that God didn't want him. He just went after it. Because he knew this: Jesus has the power to help us overcome the sins that enslave us, to heal us, and to change our lives. Jesus can change your life. He's changed mine. And you know what? Just like Jesus called out to Bartimaeus and said, "Come here," he's calling out to every one of you. That's the truth, friends. Jesus is calling you. He's calling every one of us. It doesn't matter where you are in your walk in life, he is calling out to you. He wants a relationship with you. He wants to connect with you. Don't let anything prevent that. Rather, be like Bartimaeus and respond to the call. Now, that can be a little confusing sometimes, right? Because we hear people talk about, oh, well, Jesus is calling me. And we think, oh, he's calling them into the ministry. Or like in the case of Samuel, right? When he's living with Eli and he's in bed and he hears someone calling his name. And he gets up and he runs into Eli's chamber and he's like, "What did you want?" And Eli says, "I didn't call you. Go back to bed." And he goes and he lays down and he hears it again. And he runs back in. He's like, "What did you want? You called my name." Eli says, "No, that's God calling you. The next time you hear it, say, 'Speak, Lord. Your servant is listening.'" God is calling us. It might be just to go and love on that person that seems unlovable. It might be to find a way to volunteer and help out in the community or in the church. It might be to help out in a specific ministry somewhere. Most important thing is listening for that call and then responding when you hear it. It can be scary. It can be a little overwhelming. In my case, I knew back in high school that God was calling me. I ignored it. You know why? Because I was worried he was going to ask me to do something I didn't want to do. At that time in my life, I thought, well, all I knew about Jesus calling me was, well, my brother was called to be a pastor like my dad and like my grandfather, and my cousin was called to be a missionary like her parents and like so many of my aunts and uncles. And if God's calling me, that must be what he wants me to do. I don't want to do that. The reality is, God was calling me to have a relationship with him, to get to know him, to grow in my spiritual life, to take those next steps towards him, whatever it looked like. See, when we choose to answer God when he's calling, like Bartimaeus, it can change our life. But if we ignore it, we just kind of like wander around in the dark. If Bartimaeus had ignored that call, he literally would have been wandering around in the dark because of his blindness. That's what we do to ourselves when we ignore God's calling. We are basically putting blinders on and wandering in the dark, saying we can do this on our own. Friends, I'm going to tell you, it doesn't work well when you do it that way. I tried it for a lot of years, and it was leading me down a path of destruction. It was ruining my life. I was struggling in my relationship and my marriage. I didn't have good friends. I wasn't faithful in attending church. I was doing absolutely nothing to pursue God. And it is a path of death and destruction when you do that. But when I finally woke up and said, okay, God, I hear that call. I'm a little afraid of what you're going to ask me to do, but I'm going to take that step of faith, and I'm going to listen, and I'm going to do it. God didn't want me to be a pastor. God didn't want me to be a missionary in Europe like so many of my relatives. God wanted me to be willing to follow him, to deny myself, to pick up my burdens and just pursue life with him. Jesus is calling you. What's keeping you from responding? There isn't one thing that you can come up with that's a good reason not to answer. It's like when I have this bad habit, with my job, I do 99% of it from my phone. And so I usually have earbuds in, and the phone will start ringing, and Siri chimes into my ear and has this great little voice that says, call from, and gives me either a name or if the person isn't in my phone, the phone number that's calling me. And it says, would you like to answer it? And depending on what I'm doing, most of the time it's a no. Like, I'll call that back later, or I'll send them a text message. Do we do that with Jesus? Do we say, I'll get back to him later? If you're like me, sometimes when you say, I'll get back to them later, and an hour goes by, and you're like, I haven't called them yet. Well, it's too late now. Next you know, a day or two's gone by, and they hit you up again, and you're like, hey, oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I forgot, got busy. Do we do that to God? Jesus is calling you. All we have to do is stop and take a minute. Listen. Put aside any excuses, any distractions, anything that might prevent you from answering him, put it all aside. Listen for his call and respond, because it will change your life. I want to give you all some time to do that right now. We're going to take a minute. I want everyone to just be quiet, be still where you're at. Close your eyes if you want to. But take a minute. Reach out to God and listen for his call. We're going to take a minute to do that, and then I'm going to close in prayer. God, it is so awesome that we can get into your word and we can read in the scriptures about things like your healing of Bartimaeus. And there's so many different points that we can extract from these different stories and miracles that you performed. But God, ultimately, out of every one of them, there is one thing that is a constant amongst them all, and that is you. You are that one thing that we can always hold on to, that will always be there, that never changes and will never fail. And you want nothing more than to have a relationship with us and to love us and to pour out your goodness and your grace and your mercy on us. As Dave said last week, it's simple but hard. Ultimately, it's just listening for your call and responding. Father, I pray that as we go through this week with all of the challenges and struggles that life may throw at us, through all the busyness and distractions, that we would find time every day to pause and listen for that call. And then respond. And that through that, God, we would just continue to grow in our relationship with you. God, we love you and we give you all the praise and all the glory. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.